Good evening, everyone. Let me wish all of you a very happy new year. Let me thank Felix for his kind invitation and the opportunity so early in the year to focus my mind on what is an important issue. And it was good to see and hear Farouk, who did such excellent work chairing G77 at COP27. Okay, so because of the time, I'm going to try really to be very quick. If I look at disaster risk reduction and the implications for small island developing states, I would want to start by locating it in the context of what it means for small island developing states. First, if you say Hurricane Katrina, you think of the devastation in the United States, you think of the $160 billion in damage as a result of the disaster, but it's 1% of GDP and it doesn't affect a significant area of the United States, just a very narrow geographical space. You think of, for instance, Hurricane Dorian and the level of devastation in the Bahamas and the impact on the economy. You think of Hurricane Maria in Dominica, only $1.5 billion in damage, but 95% of the housing stock of Dominica affected, the country flattened, and 226% of GDP gone in a matter of hours. So that the scale disasters and the fact that we have a hurricane season that runs from June to November really means that for small island developing states in the Caribbean, and indeed for many small island developing states across the world, we are living in the context of risk for which we have to build resilience and which we have to look to finance. Now, the cost of capital on the international market and for small island developing states in the Caribbean, with the exception of Haiti, we are regarded as affluent and well off, and therefore we cannot access concessionary financing, we cannot access grant capital, we have to buy largely from, you have to borrow largely private capital, and the borrowing rates for developed countries, which are the large emitters which cause climate change and hence are precipitating and exacerbating the number and scale of disasters. They're borrowing at 4%, and we are borrowing sometimes as much as at 20%. This is why the Bridgetown Initiative, and I don't have time to elaborate, I would urge people who haven't heard of it to have a look. This is why the Bridgetown Initiative is seeking to capitalize a new way of doing business within the context of the international development system and the multilateral development banks. This is why we are advocating that disaster risk clauses should go into sovereign debt, as Barbados has done, in which case, and we are saying that it shouldn't be limited to natural disasters, but to all disasters, in which case where there is a disaster, your debt repayment is suspended for 2 years and is tacked on then at the end of what would have been the regular loan period had the disaster not struck, so that the lender is not disadvantaged, but that the country immediately has access to capital to address the problem. So this issue of disaster links with all of the major conferences next year. What is the future of a set of small island developing states who are facing the consequences and ravages of disasters on the front line of climate change that they didn't ask for, don't want, and cannot afford to finance. You look at the fact that Caribbean SIDS, for instance, are as water scarce and water stressed as sub-Saharan Africa, and you layer that on the fact that being tourism-dependent economies, you take a country that has a population, for instance, of 250,000 people, but really you have 1 million tourists per annum, and you have to find water for all of these. You take the fact that the Caribbean and the majority of SIDS are really far from centers of production, of food, for instance, of goods, and that in crisis, which we recognized during the period of the Ukraine war and when COVID-19 was at its height, that there are supply chain disruptions that seriously impact food security, food and nutrition security. Then you look at the fact that very few SIDS really grow enough food to feed themselves. So again, you see the linkages with food and water and climate. And it becomes important then to strengthen these systems in small island developing states, which is part of the resilience building against disasters, however you frame those disasters. There is the fact too that at COP28, and I think that for us it is critical to see NDCs actually get to 1.5 and not to 2.7 and 2.5 where they currently are, because there is conversation and commiseration around the scale of the disaster felt by small island developing states, but there isn't the attempt to fix it by countries addressing what their NDC should be and what the level of the scale of their emissions are. So for us, Sendai is critical. For us, Sendai has to do with multidisciplinary approaches. It has to do with cross-sectoral approaches. It has to do with mainstreaming if we are to build resilience, if we are to avoid disasters, and if we are to address critical issues like financing, like food security, like water, and recognizing that pre-COVID, we were already, the globe, including SIDS, were already way behind in the achievement of the SDGs, and that COVID and the Ukraine war have forced us further off track. So that, in my view, it is absolutely critical that we adopt a more intersectoral approach to these conferences, that we are still seeing them and approaching them in a very siloed way, when in fact, the level of the disasters and their interconnectivity should demand that we have a more cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary approach. Going back to looking to COP28, COP27, the Secretary General spoke to the issue of early warning systems, and that is important, again, in avoiding disasters and consequentially in building resilience, and that is something that could be taken up at COP28. Equally, the whole issue of parametric insurance and the existence of databases that actually document the scale of disasters, the losses from disasters, whether those losses are sudden onset, because the Caribbean faces every year a risk of 5% loss of GDP or more, or whether there are incremental losses, so that these can be tracked. And the tracking of the losses and the scale of the losses is critical, both in relation to the framing of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, as well as being able to compute elements of loss and damage. And as soon as you say those two things, immediately you are looking toward COP28. I think that the comprehensive disaster management strategy that has been rolled out and is being used in the Caribbean is helpful and could in fact be scaled up or replicated across other small island developing states. But the key issue with which I would want to leave us, because I think I have used my 7 minutes and I've tried to pack a lot into the time, because we don't really have a lot. I think that the key issue is that we need to ask ourselves the question, rather than coming away from these conferences and saying, well, we made some progress, perhaps not as much as we want it to, but we should be deeply grateful that any progress has been made at all. That we should ask ourselves, what is it that we have been doing that has failed to get optimal outcomes, that we should now re-engineer in order to have more effective, more improved outcomes? And how can we do what we do differently at these conferences in order to get a better result? And I'm suggesting that one of those things is certainly a greater multidisciplinary approach, but how we can do it differently is itself a much larger discussion for which there is no time today. And I would want to pause here because I'm deeply conscious that there are other speakers and we are significantly beyond schedule. But thank you very much for the opportunity.